introduce Susan Landau, who is currently a visiting scholar in the Department of Computer Science at Harvard. She's an expert on cybersecurity policy. She's written a number of books on these issues. Previously, she was at Sun for 10 years, where she worked on the policy side and also the technical side. And today she's going to talk about surveillance and security and the policy issues related to those things. So here's Susan.
Thank you. And one correction, it's surveillance or security, not surveillance and. So I want to talk to you about wiretapping. And the three pictures I have up here, on the left, my left, well, my right, your left, is still from the movie The Lives of Others, a film about wiretapping in East Germany and surveillance in East Germany and the corruption of a society by excessive surveillance. It's a fabulous film if you haven't seen it. In the middle is the FBI, which has been pushing for increased wiretapping capability in law as well as in technology. And on the right is a BlackBerry, and it's partially there because of all the issues about international tapping. And I'm going to try and cover all three during my talk today. So in wiretapping, you want to focus on which technology. This is the phone that I and a couple of people in the audience grew up with. The notable thing about this phone is it doesn't move. It stays in one place. It rings very loudly. During the snowstorm we just had in western Massachusetts, these phones worked and electric phones didn't. The phone wires are designed to actually keep going even during bad storms because they have very little electricity in them. But wiretapping, which technology? Those phones don't move. These phones do move, but it turns out that wiretapping them is not particularly hard in 2 out of 3 cases. So this phone, the way you wiretap the immobile phone, the wireline phone, is modern phone technology is you put a wiretap in at the telephone central office. That's the office right near the telephone, within a few miles of where the telephone is. The wiretap goes at the telephone central office. This phone, the wiretap goes at the home location register. That's the location where the phone is registered. So when a phone call comes into the phone, the phone call first goes to the home location register, and the home location register says, oh, this person isn't roaming, and taps the call. Or the phone says, this person is roaming, but I know where they are, I know which cell they're in, and informs that cell that there's a wiretap, and that cell executes the wiretap. If the phone is roaming, and the person making the call wants to make a call, but there's a wiretap on it, then the first call that person makes, the call goes to the home location register to check whether or not the person has a paid-up phone, and the home location says, wiretap that call, and the call gets wiretapped. After that, after it's said that there's enough money on the phone for the phone to make a call, after that the calls don't go through the home location register, and usually there isn't tapping. Okay, so the tapping there is complicated. You can tap, but it's a more complicated situation. There are also other types of communications that you want to tap. One of them is something called Facebook. But Facebook turns out also to be easy to tap because all the communications go into a central location, and you tap at the central location. So you don't care about the pathway that it takes to get into that central location. You only care that it goes to the central location. And then there are communications that are hard to tap. Skype is the quintessential example. The reason Skype is hard to tap is the communication goes peer-to-peer. When you do a Skype call, it travels via other people's computers that are also Skype enabled, and it goes to the other end. Now your Skype communication is encrypted end to end, from your machine to the other person's machine. And there are 2 reasons to do this. The first is the first is that when your communication is encrypted end to end, as your communication travels on other people's machines, they can't listen in on you. The other reason is when your communication is encrypted end to end, when your communication travels on other people's machines, you can't mess with other people's machines because it's an encrypted communication. You can't download malware, you can't do anything bad to their machine. So the encryption has 2 purposes. But wiretapping has become increasingly problematic for the FBI.
And the reason is peer-to-peer communications, encrypted communications, and so on. Let me tell you the problem in wiretapping. So we've got Bob and we've got Alice. And Bob is at the coffee house and he wants to do a VoIP call with Alice, who's sitting at an airport lounge. But of course, Bob doesn't know where Alice is. So Bob's ISP, his local ISP, is SIP's ISP. Bob's ISP is going to try and initiate the conversation. And so Bob's VoIP provider is Packet Talk. So his local ISP, SIP's ISP, says Bob wants to do a VoIP communication, tells Packet Talk. Packet Talk says, oh, he wants to do it with Alice. Alice is at IP Voice. IP Voice says, let me check if Alice is online. Oh my goodness, yes she is at Fly ISP. Her IP address is whatever Alice's IP address has been assigned to here at the airport lounge by Fly ISP. And Packet Talk and IP Voice do an exchange of IP addresses. That's called a rendezvous. That's the last time that Packet Talk and IP Voice are involved in the conversation. After that, the communication travels peer-to-peer over the internet. Well, what does that mean for wiretapping? If you're the FBI and you're wiretapping Bob, you tell Packet Talk, I want to wiretap on every one of Bob's conversations. And every one that goes through Packet Talk gets wiretapped. But Bob's conversation right here, when he's at the coffee house, doesn't go through Packet Talk. Only the rendezvous information does. Now, could Packet Talk tell SIP's ISP about where Bob is? No, because it's the court and the FBI that has to send the wiretap order to SIP's ISP. It's even worse than that. We don't know who owns SIP's ISP. It might be the coffee house, or it might be the coffee house that's owned by organized crime. And this would be a very effective way for Bob to find out he has a wiretap order. Okay? So it cannot be the case that Packet Talk lets SIP's ISP know about the wiretap order. It has to be law enforcement that does. And if the conversation is brief, the conversation happens in real time, that wiretap order isn't going to get over. That's what actually makes wiretapping in a mobile IP world complicated. Okay, you guys with me? Good. So, having told you a little bit about what's complicated, I want to tell you about what U.S. law has to say. And all of wiretap law stems from issues related to the Fourth Amendment, which says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizure shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or places to be seized, things to be seized. It's really important. Our Fourth Amendment comes from what were called the writs of assistance during the colonial period, where the British had a general writ that said they could grab anything in the house. They could take anything in the house. The Fourth Amendment says you've given a warrant to search for marijuana plants. You can search for marijuana plants in the house. But you can't open the night table drawer and find the concealed weapon, the unregistered concealed weapon, because marijuana plants don't grow in night table drawers. On the other hand, if you have the warrant to look for the concealed, unregistered concealed weapon, you're allowed to go into the greenhouse and see the marijuana plants, because of course the gun could be in the, okay? So wiretap law is all subject to the Fourth Amendment. The history of U.S. wiretap law is a 1968 law on criminal wiretaps, a 1978 law that says how you can do wiretaps for foreign intelligence, and then a whole bunch of laws starting in 1994. I'm going to focus on the latter half, but let me tell you two pieces of the first two. Title III says, limits the cases under which you can do a wiretap warrant. It has to be a serious crime, one of a list of about 100. List started with 25 back in 1968. It's been expanded to about 100. Those are the only crimes under which you can get a wiretap order. It has to be probable cause that the suspect is committing this serious crime. The communication device has to be part of the planning for the crime. And it has to be essentially last resort. Doesn't have to be last resort, it just has to come close to it. Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act does many of the same things, except it's not a probable cause that the suspect is committing a serious crime. It's probable cause that the suspect is an agent of a foreign power or a terrorist group. But it is these laws that I want to focus on. Patriot Act, let me back up 1 second. CALEA. In 1994, the U.S. government passed a rather unusual law. The first two I've describe the warrant procedure for when the U.S. government can get a warrant. It also says when there can be a warrant by the states for a wiretap, which means it has to be, those states can apply for a wiretap warrant only under at least as restrictive rules as the federal government. They can be more restrictive, but they can't be less. 1994, U.S. government passes a law that's not about when the government can wiretap. It's about what the phone companies have to do to accommodate wiretaps, and it's even odder. It's much more odd than that. It says the phone companies have to design their switching networks to accommodate wiretaps. All digitally switched telephone networks have to be built wiretap enabled. Well, we had a slew of wiretap laws starting in 2001 with the Patriot Act. Patriot Act, probably the most significant piece of the Patriot Act in terms of wiretap law is there had been a wall between the foreign intelligence investigations and the Title III, the criminal investigations. The purpose of the wall was to prevent law enforcement from using the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the FISA wiretaps, which are, all you have to do is show that the person is agent of a foreign power instead of probable cause that there's committing a serious crime. It was to prevent using the lesser proof to get a wiretap and then using the evidence to convict somebody. Because with foreign intelligence, quite often it is not a criminal case. And you want to restrict the power of the government to do as invasive a search as a wiretap is, and the ability, given that the government has the ability to throw somebody into jail, you want restrictive power on the power of a wiretap. Are you guys with me? Including those of you far away? What the 2001 Patriot Act did, among other things, was it said, instead of foreign intelligence being the primary purpose of a FISA tap, it only needed to be a significant purpose. Lowered the wall between the Title III and the FISA taps, and it enabled in more cases for a FISA tap to then be used, evidence garnered from a FISA tap to be used in a criminal case. But the thing that I want to focus on is CALEA, and in 2003, the FBI asked that CALEA be extended to cases where a VoIP, voice over IP. There are other things that happened. The warrantless wiretapping appeared, the Protect America Act, the FISA Amendments Act. So let me tell you briefly about those. I'll start with the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. So it was passed in the transition from a wireline phone to digitally switched phones. And in 2003, the FBI said, we're moving from digitally switched phones to the internet. We need help. Okay? The law, CALEA, explicitly says it has an exemption for information services, okay, which in 1994 meant the internet. But in 2003, the FBI pushed for CALEA extending to the internet, to voice over IP. In 2004, the FCC agreed with this, somewhat to our surprise, that R being civil liberties groups and industry. In 2005, the appeals court agreed with the FCC. And I recently spoke to someone at the FCC who said they were as startled as the rest of us. Okay, 2-to-1 decision, the appeals court said that CALEA could extend to VoIP. Now, what the FCC had said is CALEA could extend to certain cases of VoIP, what's called facilities-based VoIP. What that means is it looks like a telephone from you to the central office. It can be anything at all. In the phone company, it could be packet, it could be circuit, could be anything at all, and then at the other end, it doesn't matter. But from you to the phone company, it looks like a wire, same way it always did. And those kind of cases are actually very easy to wiretap because you put a wiretap on at the phone company the same way you always did. I just want to tell you, in this context, a little bit about the Protect America Act and the FISA Amendments Act. This is a map of the world, and as you notice, the United States is in the middle, which always happens when the U.S. designs the map. But in this particular case, there's a good reason for the U.S. to be in the middle. The red lines are the cables, the fiber optic cables. This map is a few years old. You'll notice huge cables that all come and go to the United States, and that's because of the fiber overbuilding that happened in the 1990s. You'll also notice cables from South America and so on. What happens as a result of these cables is when you have a call from Europe to Asia, it often goes through the United States. When you have a call from Brazil to Argentina, it often goes through the United States. Why? Because the previous technology was satellite technology. When you do a phone call from Brazil to Argentina and it goes up to a satellite, there's a quarter-second delay. People don't like a quarter-second delay in a phone conversation. It's irritating. That much of a delay is noticeable, and it bothers us. But if you do it by a fiber optic cable to Miami and back, there's no quarter-second delay. It happens like that. Now, you do a call from Brazil to Argentina by way of Miami, and it goes into the United States, and it's very easy, physically, to wiretap it. Legally, it wasn't easy to wiretap it, because legally, it was a call that was inside the United States, so you need a wiretap order. But to the NSA and to the U.S. government, it seemed inappropriate. You would need a wiretap order for that. Other case that involves calls that go through the United States, even though it seems like they shouldn't, is it used to be the case you couldn't call from Taiwan to China because the Chinese government and the Taiwanese government didn't talk to each other. So the way you called from Taiwan to China is you called by way of a switch in California, and then the call went through. Now, if you're AT&T, you're very careful about how you write your contracts. And you know that the situation of Taiwan and China not talking to each other is not going to last forever. But you want to make that deal that you get the calls for a long time, so you write the contract. So the contract exists much longer than the inability to call. So calls from Taiwan to China go through the United States. And it did used to be the case, it's no longer the case now, but it used to be that if you did Gmail, you used a server in the United States. Now Google has servers all over. But for a while, the servers of Gmail, Yahoo, and so on were all in the US. So you could be doing email from Europe to Europe, from the UK to the UK, and it would be going through the United States. So the US government saw this as an opportunity to more cheaply wiretap, but the problem was the law was written in such a way that you needed a wiretap warrant because the communication was inside the United States. They passed the Protect America Act, which said that all calls where one end is reasonably likely to be outside the United States don't need a wiretap warrant. That law lasted 6 months, was controversial, got renewed for 2 weeks, and then didn't get renewed. It was replaced by the FISA Amendments Act, and there will be a quiz at the end of this talk. You have to distinguish when it's a U.S. person, a non-U.S. person, whether the communication is wired, wireless. A protected communication means a wiretap warrant is needed. An unprotected communication means it can be tapped without a warrant. If you look at the map of the United States and you're calling from the Midwest to Maine, upper Midwest to Maine, it's quite likely that a call can go through Canada. If you're calling, certainly that's true when you're in the upper peninsula of Maine. When you're calling from Mexico to the Caribbean, it could go through the United States. There are all these complicated edge cases of when can you tap, when can you not tap with a warrant, without a warrant. FISA Amendments Act, you can ask me questions later, but I just did the map to show you the complexity. So wiretapping, what you want to do when you talk about wiretapping, you want to know how efficacious are the solutions. And it depends on the type of case. So when CALEA passed in 1994, the FBI director went to Congress. He went to all congressmen and said, look, you don't want kids in your district kidnapped, and we can't find the kidnapper. You don't want us to not be able to listen to the call. That is, we got the call and we can't figure out what the guy is saying. But the numbers tell a slightly different story. The numbers tell you a story of fewer. Now this is 1994, this is numbers from 1968 to about 1998, and then the situation changes. The number of kidnapping cases in which wiretap warrants were used were about 6 a year, because you didn't know who the kidnapper was, and if you were listening into the call at the house of the family where the person was kidnapped, That's not a wiretap, not from the point of law and not from the point of technology. It's what's called a consensual overhear. You don't need a wiretap warrant. The numbers go up recently, and the reason the numbers go up is because of cell phones. So when a kid gets kidnapped, they're often kidnapped by a non-custodial parent, the parent who doesn't have custody. We don't think of that as a kidnapping, but it is a kidnapping. But then you know the phone number of the non-custodial parent, often the kid, that is, you know the cell phone number, and the kid often has a cell phone. And so tracking the cell phone tracks the kid, and so that is a kind of, it's not exactly a content wiretap, it's a pen register, a trap and trace, so it's now used more often. Other kinds of investigations, when the wiretap laws were passed, gambling was the big case, and the reason for that is that gambling is what organized crime supported itself on. We got state gambling in terms of lotteries and so on, and gambling became less of an issue for organized crime as a support method. It moved to drugs. And in 2006, the Department of Justice had a counterterrorism white paper that said 441 defendants have been charged with terrorism or terrorism-related activities. When you look at the numbers, you discover that only 123 had prison sentences, 14 had 5 years or more, 6 had 20 years or more. When you look at the numbers again, the numbers look better than this. So on the one hand, only 6 had serious cases, but on the other hand, there are many people who got deported who are bad guys, and they don't show up in the numbers I've just shown you. What that tells you is the numbers are kind of funny. So I've told you a little bit about why wiretaps are not so useful. Let me tell you a little bit about why wiretaps are useful. And this is a case that the federal government doesn't talk about in terms of wiretaps being useful. Najibullah Zazi was an Afghan, raised partially in the refugee camps of Pakistan and partially in the United States, mostly in the United States. His family moved to Colorado. At some point, he was selling food off a food cart in the U.S., was well liked by his customers. At some point, he went to Pakistan a whole bunch of times. He had been married to a cousin, and he was going to visit his wife. And then, after one of his trips, he came back to the U.S., went to stay with his family in Colorado. And the next thing you knew, there was this news story that said, Colorado man who drives to New York in a rented car, stopped by the George Washington Bridge, car inspected, visited some friends in Queens, driving back was arrested. Suspicion of terrorism. Next story says a little bit more, next story says a little bit more, next story says a little bit more, and then finally you get him pleading guilty to potentially blowing up subway cars. And when you read the affidavit and you read the story, that you discover that in August of, this is going to be 2010, not right, 2009, August of 2009, he rents a hotel room twice in Colorado. After the second time, the FBI goes in and examines the hood over the stove and discovers chemicals used in bomb making. They do web searches they do searches of his laptop to discover what web searches he's been doing. He's done web searches for how to pick up other chemicals used in bomb making. These are in Queens, New York. There are videos of him picking up other chemicals used in bomb making around Colorado, which he then presumably used in the motel room. But what you notice is the FBI did not search the first time he rented the motel room, okay? And you also notice that he made 3 increasingly frantic phone calls the second time he was in the hotel room. What I've just told you, that last fact tells you why he got picked up. He made 3 increasingly frantic calls to somewhere outside the United States for information about bomb making. They checked the hotel room afterwards, found the chemicals, tracked him, arrested him after he got spooked and started driving. So they searched him when he came into New York because they were afraid he had bad stuff in his car, searched him when he got spooked and started driving back west, and caught him on a few small lies, and then finally caught him and his family on a few small lies and got him to confess. But the key piece of information was he made these 3 increasingly frantic calls to Pakistan. So I've told you in some cases wiretapping information is not as useful as the law enforcement claims. In other cases it's been tremendously useful. The other thing I want to tell you is that transactional information is remarkably revelatory. It located the planner of the September 11th attacks through his cell phone when he was in Pakistan. In July 2005, there were bombings that destroyed subway cars, 3 bombings that destroyed subway cars in London, and 1 that destroyed a bus. There was an attempted replication on July 21st. The Brits tracked the cell phone of a friend of one of the alleged bombers of the July 21st group. They found it in Rome, near the brother of one of the alleged bombers. They went to the apartment, found the guy himself, the alleged bomber. It's cut time for investigation in Marshal Services, as the U.S. Marshal Services tracked fugitives. It used to be it took 42 days on average to find a fugitive. With cell phones, you check where the guy is at 10 p.m. at night. You check where he is at 8 a.m. in the morning, and then the next day you look who his family and friends are in that location, and the next day you pick him up. 2 days is the average now. This is not your parents' communication world. When I was growing up, that telephone was the kind of phone I used. I actually still have one on my desk in my study. But that telephone, in order to call England, for example, I had grandparents in England, you had to book the phone call ahead of time. In the 1970s, you could dial direct. Now you can dial direct, and you don't even have to know where the person you're calling is. It's not your parents' business world. We outsource, which means that we do lots of communications abroad. We do just-in-time manufacturing. We send critical infrastructure information over the network. And we have mobile communications. It's not your parents' business world or communications world. So it used to be that switches looked different from one another, but that's not the case anymore. Using a Cisco switch in the United States, they're using the same Cisco switch in other parts of the world. Somebody figures out how to break into a Cisco switch in Estonia, they know how to break into that same Cisco switch in Kansas. And what's more, through the internet they can get there. Everybody's using the same kind of technology. When you build wiretapping capability into communications infrastructure and into applications, you create 2 kinds of risk. You remove the carriers from the equation. And we all know that if you have to explain to somebody, you have a warrant, here's the warrant, and so on, that effort causes you to be more honest yourself. The other thing is that you remove technical forms of minimization. And when, about 5 years ago, when the Protect America Act passed, we made these points. I did this joint work with several other people. We made these points. A couple of years later, the New York Times reported that the kind of wiretapping allowed under the Protect America Act and the FISA Amendments Act had picked up various people they shouldn't have picked up. One of them was former President Bill Clinton. Building wiretapping capability into communications infrastructure and applications creates risk of exploitation and over-collection. Let me give you a couple of examples. One is Greece. So for 10 months between 2004 and 2005, 100 senior members of the Greek government were wiretapped. What happened is Vodafone Greece had bought a switch from Ericsson. They hadn't arranged for wiretapping capability in the switch. When the switch got updated, wiretapping capability was built into the switch, but because Vodafone Greece hadn't paid for wiretapping, there was no auditing capability. Wiretapping capability was shut off. Somebody went into the switch, turned on the wiretapping, sent the wiretapped communications to 16 cell phones. This went on for 10 months. When the switch was whenever the switch was updated, the wiretapping capability was updated. One time the wiretappers screwed up. They didn't update the wiretapping capability. SMS messages went awry. Vodafone Greece began investigating the problem, discovered the wiretapping. The wiretapping got shut off. I've now told you how it happened. I haven't told you who, and nobody knows who. There are suspicions, but nobody knows who. Telecom Italia, between 1996 and 2006, 10,000 Italians were wiretapped illegally. This included judges, politicians, referees, business people, celebrities, sports figures. Okay? What I've now told you is that there was no major political or business discussion that happened in private. Case is still going through the courts, but presumably this is a case of bribery and blackmail and corruption. 10,000 people in Italy, I'm sorry, 6,000, is it 6,000 people? It's 6,000 people, 1 in 10,000 Italians was wiretapped. Okay. Cisco built an architecture for wiretapping IP switches. They did the right thing by publishing it. Tom Cross, an IBM researcher, studied those specs. And so these specs were based on European standards for law enforcement interception. What Tom Cross discovered is that they're easy to spoof, which means it's easy, can allow unauthorized parties to receive the interception. Making it easy to wiretap means we're wiretapping. Let me tell you about the exigent letters. So post-September 11th, the Communications Assistant Unit of the FBI was placed in the same room with people from the major telecommunications carriers. And the idea was to help get information, transactional information, who, what, when of a call, quickly. And they did so. They had something called the National Security Letters, which said you didn't need to go through a subpoena, you just needed this National Security Letter, lower level of proof. It was a piece of a legal document that said this is important to an ongoing investigation. One of the telco guys said, how about you do exigent letters, just a quick letter that says, you got us a national security letter quickly. FBI thought this was a good idea, did it, carried the practice on to other FBI offices. The result, exigent letters were never followed up with national security letters. Data was given without written requests. If you don't have a written request, you can't track what information was handed from the communications carrier to the FBI. There was a lack of specificity. Let me tell you what lack of specificity means with a concrete example. The Code of Federal Regulations says you can't get any transactional information or wiretap order on a journalist without the written signature of the U.S. Attorney General. Nobody lower can do that, okay? That's because the freedom of the press is really important in the United States. It's not a law, it's a regulation. They used an exigent letter on a Washington Post, also on a New York Times reporter, but the story I'm telling you is about the Washington Post. They used the exigent letter on a Washington Post reporter. They didn't put any dates on. They thought this reporter had been talking to a terrorist. They didn't think she had been doing anything wrong, but they thought they could track the terrorist. How easily can a reporter talk to sources if the sources know that who she's talking with are tracked? So they were supposed to track her for a few weeks while she was in Indonesia. They tracked her for 7 months because they didn't have dates on it. And they deployed what are called community of interest tools. Community of interest tools say, who are you talking with? Who are those people talking with? Let's look at your larger and larger community. Those were deployed without written requests. When you wiretap or you do any kind of surveillance, you have to ask what are the threats we face? We face the threat of non-state actors. We face the threat of insiders, and the insider I have up here is Kim Philby. He was the British spy, the Soviet spy working for the British intelligence unit for a very long time, very damaging, and nation states. The non-state actors are not terribly, and when I talk to you about what threats we face, it's not only the one you expect, it's also our friends. Okay? Let me say more. The threats from non-state actors are still at the nuisance level. Now, if you live near the Worcester Airport and the Worcester Airport was disabled for 6 hours, that's unpleasant. But all of these are at the nuisance level. They haven't been serious attacks yet. You hear it sometimes in the press, but it's not for real. The threats from insiders, however, are serious. And the reason they're serious is these guys know how you work, they know how you protect yourself, they know your systems, they know how to get away with attacks on you without your knowing about it. So the example that I can think of aside from Kim Philby, of course, is Bradley Manning, which is another insider attack, except in that case, I'm not even sure I'd call it an attack in the sense it wasn't organized. It was certainly an attack, but it wasn't an organized attack. It was a whatever it was. Threats from state actors. So in 2006, we heard about the first story of an attack where stuff came out of 4 government military sites. In all 4 cases, it was unpatched systems, and the attackers went in, the exploiters went in, took the files they wanted, packed them up, took them out, one after the other. space of 8 hours. Then we began hearing about more and more. Trojans hidden within emails, sophisticated attacks using highly targeted emails, careful reconnaissance that allow the attackers to go in, examine what they want, and then slowly move the stuff, then quickly move the stuff out when they're ready. Who's spying? During the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union. And then in the 1970s, attention shifted to include defense contractors. So Soviet trade groups would come over and, for example, visit Lockheed. And they'd wear double-sided tape on the bottoms of their shoes so they could pick up little pieces of composite metal to find what composite metal we were using to build our bombers or surveillance planes, okay? But these kinds of delegations are expensive. You have to spend many years developing the contacts and so on, okay? By the 1980s, it wasn't just the Soviet Union, it was some of our friends as well. So the French government, for example, says, look, in military affairs, we're allies. In economic affairs, we compete. Israel, Japan, Iran, many countries. The estimate in 2003 was $200 billion for exploitation, for spying on for industry, but nobody knows the real numbers. There are two new issues, the internet and China. It's expensive to develop the contacts and send trade delegations over, and it involves people. Doing it via the internet is much faster and much cheaper. I want to switch topics completely and talk to you about what threats we face in a different domain. That's Katrina. And here are some natural disasters. So you know about the Haitian earthquake, but the rest of those numbers are amazing. So when you start talking to first responders about what do they need during a crisis, they need, first of all, they need land mobile radio, because wireline phones go down, cell towers go down, satellite phones don't work terribly well if they're tall buildings or clouds or mountains in the way. They use land mobile radio. Have you ever counted the number of antenna on the back of a police car? They're about a half dozen, right? That's for the police car to communicate with his district, with the next district over, with the fire department the next district over, with the ambulance, and the ambulance the next district over. They're all not interoperable, okay? None of them interoperate. So what first responders need is land mobile radio that's interoperable, and secure. I talked to the head of information assurance at the NSA, the technical director at the information assurance at NSA. He said he wants to see land mobile radio available at Radio Shack. And then he said, oh no, secure land mobile. And then he said, oh no, I'm not supposed to say that because he's not supposed to mention a particular company. Okay, but I told him I was going to use it anyway. Well, of course, if secure land mobile radio is available at Radio Shack, it's not just the first responders who are going to use it. Bad guys are going to use it too. But that's NSA policy. They want to see that. I want to talk to you for a moment about the preamble to the Constitution. It's not something we talk about very much, but it happens that it turns up in legal cases occasionally. And the point I want to raise to you is that the preamble talks about securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Well, what does that mean about what we need in terms of communications security and communications interception? We want to enable secure communications in terms of national and international disaster, and I think the numbers I just showed you show you how often natural disasters happen and how big they are when they happen. So we want to secure communication when there's a national disaster. Because of cyber exploitation, we want to secure civilian communications, and we want to enable successful investigations of criminal and terrorism cases. And I posit to you that's the order in which we should think about communications security. What do we need in terms of communications surveillance? Transactional information is the way the NSA has gone the last 10 years. 10 years ago, 11 years ago, the NSA backed off on the control of crypto in export control. And it was not because they don't want to listen in, but because they found transactional information and network exploitation where they had to go. Use the vulnerability of end hosts to get at conversations when you can't get at them otherwise, and be like the NSA, use clever solutions. The point is that CALIA isn't free, but building wiretapping capability into the infrastructure, into applications, creates all sorts of risks, and it's not the FBI who's footing the bill. What do you do for getting communications security right? Point is that security of communication is important for freedom, security, human dignity, and consent of the governed. It should be designed with the principle of securing the blessings of freedom for posterity. So I mentioned the preamble. What do I mean? Well, when you build wiretapping capability into a switch or an application, it lasts a very long time. Okay? You want security of the freedom of the blessings of freedom for posterity? You don't build surveillance capability into your infrastructure. Any suspension of communications privacy should be brief, measured in days or weeks, not months or years. Now, why would I mention suspending communications privacy? When you're in Washington, they talk about what happens if a nuclear bomb is detonated in New York or Washington. You can imagine that all sorts of things would happen to our laws. Okay? In a case of national crisis, communications privacy would disappear. You plan on it disappearing for days and weeks, you don't build surveillance into the infrastructure. You plan on it lasting for months and years, you build it into the infrastructure. And then the canary in the coal mine principle. Communications surveillance should not impede the working of the press. Okay? Because if you impede the working of the press, the next thing that goes is the people's freedom. And I want to end with a keyboard, or not quite with a keyboard, to remind you about how long infrastructure lasts. That keyboard was designed so that when you type the letters that most frequently appear in the English language, which are E, T, and so on, the keys don't hit each other. The metal keys that extend from that key to the paper don't hit each other. When was the last time any of you typed on a typewriter with metal keys? This was a typewriter that was made to make it complicated to type the most frequent letters. Infrastructure lasts. You build wiretapping capability into the infrastructure, it's going to last a very long time. So with that, I will sell you my book if you want to buy it. I don't actually have copies, but that's my book where it talks more about these issues, and thanks very much. I guess I talked quickly, which leaves you lots of times for questions. Landon.
So you said that society needs to use the vulnerability of end hosts. I was curious what you meant by that.
Sure. So Landon's question was, I'll repeat the questions for those of you far away. Landon said, what did I mean by the vulnerability of end hosts? And that's great because it lets me talk about things that I didn't have time to talk about. So the FBI, about a year ago, 14 months ago, began saying it's going dark and it's having trouble wiretapping all sorts of communications. It's having trouble wiretapping peer-to-peer. It's having trouble wiretapping when the communication is encrypted. It's having trouble wiretapping when the communications provider is outside the United States. And it wants better capabilities written into law. And the answer is the FBI needs to be smarter about what it's doing. So if I go back all the way to the beginning of my talk, I had the slide that said Facebook isn't hard to wiretap because it's a centralized communication. Lots of communications we do over the internet, in fact, are centralized even though we're using a peer-to-peer communication network. What you want to do is separate the communications that you already have capability for wiretapping, such as the circuit-based systems, the ones which are not hard technically, but may be hard for the FBI or local, state and local law enforcement because they don't have the technological know-how or the connections with the provider. So for example, at the hearing that happened last February, there was the FBI, there was the president of the chiefs of state and local police, and that guy, who was a law enforcement officer from Virginia, talked about how hard it was to wiretap all these different cell phones because each of them has a different operating system and a different way of working, da-da-da-da-da. And that's true, but it's not true in the sense that the FBI should be the central repository for such information. And they should have that information cataloged and not have it the case that when a state or local guy is tapping a phone they've never seen before. They talk to a buddy at the state agency, and the buddy says, oh, I talked to so-and-so at the FBI. So you call out so-and-so at the FBI, but if so-and-so is off on vacation, and so you can't get through. It should be up and accessible to state and local. They should be the go-to source. At the same time, they should also be a research agency. So right now, FBI is a case-based agency, and when they have a wiretap, they try to figure out how to do that particular wiretap order on that particular technology. They should be going to communications conferences, learning what new communications technology is evolving, and learn how to wiretap, learn who to talk to at the particular company, and develop that ahead of time. So when they, wait, I'm getting to it. Okay, that takes care of 2/3 of their cases. Not 2/3 of the cases. It takes care of a lot more than 2/3 of their cases. It takes care of almost all their cases. Then there are the cases that are hard, like Skype on a well-secured machine. And for that, they have to be clever and use the vulnerability of the end host. So I heard a talk by the former head of information assurance at NSA, and he said the most effective nation states, if they want to go after you, they're going to find a way to get in. Okay? So it's a question of how much you spend to go after your particular target. The FBI would like to be able to have everything simple because it makes their costs low. But making their costs low makes all the rest of us vulnerable. And our risks are somewhere else. You make the costs high, some of the cases they're going to have to spend a lot of money or not go after it. That's not the solution they want, but that's what I mean by use the vulnerability of end hosts. I don't mean make end hosts vulnerable.
Okay.
Long
It's
answer,
like-
but I wanted to put it all in
Right,
context.
so you're advocating for, rather than making changes to the infrastructure which will be expensive and make everybody vulnerable, to sort of hack into individuals' machines?
So Landon's question, should I repeat the questions?
Sure.
Yeah. So Landon's question was I really saying that instead of making infrastructure and applications vulnerable, I'm urging the FBI to hack into machines? And the answer is yes. The FBI already does that. It has something called, it has a keylogger. I think the keylogger is Magic Lantern, if I remember correctly. It has Triggerfish, where it acts like a cell phone provider and picks up signal. It has all sorts of tools like this. These tools are expensive to deploy. They should be expensive to deploy. You don't want a rogue agency like the Stasi, and mostly we don't have a rogue agency. I mean, there have been rogue instances. Whitey Bulger in Boston is an example of a rogue instance, but mostly we don't have rogue law enforcement. But the problem is that when you make wiretapping easy to happen, you have lots of cases of wiretapping where you shouldn't have it, and I gave the case of the exigent letters. But you also, in the case of the kinds of exploitations we're worried about now, which are the cyber exploitations, and the Deputy Secretary of Defense, William Lynn, a year ago, wrote that the most serious long-term cybersecurity problem is the theft of intellectual property. And he didn't mean Disney films, he meant plans and research and business plans and so on from high-tech and pharmacology and so on companies. When that's your risk, then making it easy to wiretap is exactly the wrong way to go. When Lockheed Martin doesn't secure itself, Lockheed Martin is at risk. When Verizon doesn't secure its switch, every communication through Verizon is at risk. I promise not to answer so long a second time. Yes.
Why do you call it surveillance or security?
Why do I call it surveillance or security? Because the usual argument about wiretapping or other kinds of surveillance is we got to balance privacy versus security. And I think that's a false model because in many cases the surveillance capabilities do not make us more secure. And in this particular argument, in the argument about the risks of building surveillance into communications system, I posit that it actually makes us less secure. So
Because you expose it to other parties?
that's right, that's right. So if what we're worried about is cyber exploitation and so on, building surveillance into communications networks or into applications, making it easier to wiretap is making us less secure. Now, we're never going to get to the point that applications or infrastructure are completely secure. I'll quote the former director of the Information Assurance Directorate. But it depends how much money and how much incentive the party going after you has. If it's organized crime, they're going to have a lot of money and they're going to have some incentive, but they're not going to have the money or the incentive that a nation state has. So the harder you make it to exploit, the more secure you're making the parties you need to make secure. Yeah.
So it seems like the end game is that everybody puts encryption on their devices anyway. So it seems like Skype as an example. That's the direction things are going to be moving in. So my question is, and your discussion with Landau was very interesting and seemed to address a way that law enforcement could still access information if they wanted to in that context. But my question is, if that is the end game, then what is it that we're really worrying ourselves about?
Sure.
Is it the midterm between now and then?
So the question was, it looks like the end game is encryption on everybody's devices and so on. And so if that's the end game, why are we worried now? I'm going to give a long answer again because I rushed through my talk, so I skipped details, so now you get to hear them. So in the 1990s, when we were fighting the crypto wars, there was this funny race going on between whether Europe, and perhaps Asia, but mostly Europe, whether Europe would beat us and steal enough business away from US computer manufacturers that the FBI and the NSA would relent and the US government would change its policy and allow the deployment of strong encryption, or whether the FBI would get, and perhaps the NSA, would get Europe to put restrictions like we had on crypto. And it was just not clear which one was going to happen, and in fact, the former happened, and partially it was Europe, and partially it was various kinds of domestic issues. We have all kinds of law in the United States. As Larry Lessig said, there's East Coast law and West Coast law. East Coast law is Washington, West Coast law is technology. So I found it startling when Google did not have any way of logging onto your email but by a fixed password. And I talked to one of my friends at Google and said, I want to use S-key, which is a set of one-time passwords, and he said they'll never go for it because that's too complicated for the average user. And I suggested that, I don't know, maybe within 6 months of Gmail coming out. Then it was nice that you could do SSL mail, that is secure Gmail, but that was not the default option. Okay, and it was only after Google got exploited by China that Google changed its policy. The answer is there's this funny contest going on. I would actually posit that part of the contest that's going on is one that's completely unseen, and it's in different parts of the US government. So the FBI 14 months ago went public and said, we want a new law. There were hearings in February. There's no bill yet. The lack of bill is not because I testified opposite the FBI, no matter how well my testimony went. The lack of bill is because other parts of the federal government, viz. Defense Department and State Department, opposed what the FBI want. Now, the State Department has its set of issues because it wants the ability of human rights workers and journalists to report in security and safety, and that means all kinds of encryption and so on. Defense Department is looking at other kinds of things. Defense Department, DARPA just funded, I think it's a $5 million grant, which is not $5 million worth of funding, not a huge amount of money, but it's interesting. It's about securing Tor better. So Tor, for those of you who don't know, the onion routing is an application level. It's an application that runs on top of the internet that secures your transactional information. It doesn't work in real time, so you can't use it for VoIP, but you can use it for web browsing and so on. You can use it for accessing your Gmail. You can use it for all sorts of things. You don't need it for you don't really need it for accessing your Gmail, but I guess you could use it for that. You can use it for all sorts of things. And the point is that this technology was developed at the Naval Research Labs. It's useful for law enforcement and it's useful for national security. You've got an operative working undercover in the Mideast, wants to communicate back with Annapolis, doesn't want the fact that they're a safe house to be exposed, they use Tor. The ISP doesn't know who they're communicating with. Okay? And I'm giving you a real example. The details are not correct, but the flavor of the example is correct. You're law enforcement, you're going into a chat room, you want to see who's communicating in this child pornography chat room. You don't want your IP address to say FBI.gov. So real examples, but that kind of technology, one, only works if there are users who are not working for the US government, because otherwise it's obvious everybody using it is working for the US government. So the code line is, the catch line is anonymity loves company. You want this system to be more widely used. DARPA has just funded $5 million worth of research to improve the quality of Tor in all sorts of ways. So you got different sides of the US government working different ways. That's part of an answer. Another part of the answer is content is not as important as transactional information. So let me give you a concrete example. If the weekend before Oracle announced it was going to buy Sun, you knew that the CEO of Oracle talked to the CEO of Sun, and then both of them talked to their lawyers, and then both of them talked again, and then both of them talked to their CTOs, and so on. You would know what was happening without ever actually listening to the conversation. But I also gave you plenty of examples. So it's a funny kind of race. And then I was looking at somebody's PhD thesis the other day, and she made the point that the NSA in the 1990s knew it couldn't stop the deployment of crypto, but it could delay the deployment of crypto. I don't know that the FBI is operating on the same level, that it can't stop this. I think it still thinks it can stop this, and it's wrong. I think it's wrong, but it can certainly delay it. And every day that it delays it is one more day it has an easier way of doing a certain kind of investigation. I don't know if I can do questions from other people or not. Okay.
How much is the question of surveillance tied up with personal identity? It used to be the case that people could go somewhere else and start a new life or something like that.
It depends what kind of job you do, doesn't it, and who you are, and so on. I mean, it's much harder in the U.S. Did everybody hear the question, by the way? I'm assuming you did. It used to be in the U.S. you didn't need a whole lot of identification. Now you need it for even, waitressing jobs and so on. That's part of the answer. Another part of the answer has to do with an information transference that I mentioned twice to people here, so I apologize for repeating to people here. Used to be when you did a phone call, the two ends of the phone call knew where each other was because the phone was at a physical location. Now that information is owned by the phone company because people do calls via cell phones. So when you call somebody, you're calling their cell phone, the phone company knows who the two people are and where they're communicating from, as opposed to before when the phone company knew there was a call but they didn't know who was actually communicating. I think it's a lot harder to start a new life than it used to be. And that's about general surveillance rather than about communications surveillance. So I think I'm telling you a general comment rather than something that I have a whole lot of information more about. How about here? Are we done?
I think we're done.
Done.
Well, thank you.